thank you all for coming. It's a treat today to welcome David Kennedy. David has been a great supporter of CAC over the years, and it's always special when you make a presentation. So David's from political science and is director of the Honors College here, and his title today is Impending, no, not the new title.
I'm sorry, I just didn't know.
Student loan debt, impending apocalypse, or alarmist hyperbole.
Yeah, mouthful. Well, Ron, thanks for having me today, and I appreciate you guys taking time to come. I have an apology for, there has been some very intriguing CACs of late, and we were joking about this is a poor follow-up to all these discussions on the existence of God, or how many ways you can determine the existence of God. And so I appreciate you coming to this maybe a little bit more dry session, but I have been remiss in not being able to make these recent CACs, and it's really driven me crazy. But with this hat as honors director, my time is not my own as much as maybe it used to be when I was just in the classroom. Although your time's still not your own, but it spans broader lengths of time. So let me give you a little background about student loan debt. Why is a political scientist and someone that's directing the Honors College talking about student loan debt? It's something I have a passion for. I think all of us have a passion. I know we have a passion for our students, and student loan debt is certainly something that impacts the vast majority of our students. And so as faculty, as lovers of higher education, this is something that should be near and dear to all of us in terms of looking out for the best interest of our students. I also have some more intimate experience with the student loan sphere. I've had the good fortune for the last several years to sit on an executive council for a nonprofit student loan organization. And as a result, I've got to see some of the impacts of rising student loan debt from a little bit different perspective. And that is students applying for loans in the private sphere, in the nonprofit sphere, and in the federal government-backed sphere. And I'm curious, how many people in here, is there anyone in here with student services background, or everyone kind of coming at this from the educational space? How many of you have children that you have walked through the process of applying for a FAFSA or TASFA for federal loans? Okay, so a lot of this may be fairly new to you. Well, let's go ahead and dive into it a little bit. So, as I noted in my blurb for this discussion, student loan debt in the United States has surpassed $1.2 trillion. It's currently second only to mortgage debt in the United States. And this number is a very tricky number. So we know that there's over $1 trillion in federal government-backed student loans out there today. What we don't know is the number, the exact number on the private loan space. They estimate it to be, if the public space is $1 trillion, then the private, just about 0.2 trillion. But my guess is it's a lot larger than that. And I've had a hard time. We actually had, for this nonprofit that I sit on, we actually had some students from the University of Texas that were graduate students in the Department of Education do some research. They did a report for a committee looking at student loan debt, and they had a very difficult time bumping into the private loan sphere. And it makes sense. It's a private corporate space where profit is everything. And so as a result, they're going to be pretty tight-lipped about their default rates. They're going to be tight-lipped about their collection processes because they're in competition with other banks. And so it's a totally different game. So what does student loan debt load look like? 2/3 of students graduate with some type of student loan debt, and the average borrower, so the average student that does graduate with debt, that's in that 2/3 category, the average amount is $26,000 in loans that they have upon graduation. 10% graduate with $40,000 or more. And then what you hear in the news a lot are that small percentage of students that are graduating with extraordinary debt, right? And 1% roughly graduate with $100,000 or more in loans. So to put it in perspective, if you just took the average amounts, the average borrow $26,000 in loans, what does that look like in terms of repayment? Well, if you took a 10-year note, 3.8% interest, which is sweet, it's going to be the best rate that you could get at the federal level, then you're looking at roughly $38,600 in total payback with a monthly payment over that 10-year period of $320 a month. It can certainly put a little dent in your quality of life, in your standard of living. And as I said, this isn't the best case scenario. If you jack that interest rate up to about 8%, 10% or higher, which you're often going to see, particularly in the private sphere, then this number doubles, more than doubles. So a little different way of looking at it, student loan debt alone is roughly 7% of the total federal debt today. What does that mean? Well, let your imagination run wild. As a political scientist, a social scientist, you think in terms of lost opportunity costs, everything from impact on standard of living for these students, retirement savings that are remiss because these students are trying to pay back their loans. A huge thing today is bad credit ratings, because once they hit the default rate, all kinds of bad things happen to their credit rating, which has a cascading effect on their ability to get a first-time home mortgage, to be able to continue with graduate school, all kinds of things. Other costs. In addition to the financial costs, the obvious costs of student loan debt, there was a recent Gallup poll, as in it came out about a month and a half ago, that was widely touted in some of the press, and it looked at the impact on health and overall well-being, student loan debt, and the impact it had. And it looked at 5 categories. It split it along the lines of purpose, social, financial, community, and physical. And I put the definitions out to the left because they're not necessarily intuitive. And I guess you could say the bottom line on this is that the more debt students have, the worse off physically and mentally they are. And that shouldn't really be a surprise to most people, right? With one caveat that or maybe you thought about, if someone has $100,000 in debt, but they're a medical student and they're looking at a starting salary that makes that debt load a very manageable debt load, then you can see how that would kind of buck this trend where, so it's not only that you have a high debt that leads to a poor quality of life. We know that there's got to be some other factors involved in that, like what your career path is, your potential income, etc. So another take on student debt, there was a Brookings Institute study. It was actually put out by the Brown Center on Education Policy that also came out this summer, and it was titled as a student loan crisis on the horizon, and its short conclusion was no. It looked at Federal Reserve data. It was called the Survey of Consumer Finances, the SCF, and came up with some basic conclusions. And I put those conclusions here. Just read through them. While there were significant increases in average debt levels, now that's important. Average debt went up, total debt went up, so student debt is going up. They totally concede that. There's little indication of a significant number of borrowers with enormous debt burdens. Now remember, we looked at that 1%, right? So they're saying the vast bulk of students don't have those ridiculous numbers associated with their debt that we see in the press all too frequently. Leading the study to state that our analysis of more than 2 decades of data suggests that the reality of student loans may not be as dire as many commentators fear. Now, that may seem kind of watered down, so they're not saying that it isn't bad, they're just saying it's not as bad as maybe people are making it out to be. They concluded 1/4 of the increase in student debt since '89 can be directly attributed to Americans obtaining more education, especially graduate degrees. Now think about that. 1/4 of the increase in debt is associated with students getting more advanced degrees. That's not a bad thing. In fact, you could say in this day and age, that's more and more of a necessity, right? So an important point to take into account. SCF data strongly suggests that increases in the average lifetime incomes of college-educated Americans have more than kept pace with increases in debt loads. So if you look at areas other than higher education and you look at starting salaries, they've been going up. I was really bummed out. I was talking with my daughter the other day, and she's got a good friend whose sister last year graduated with a computer science degree from University of Texas, Austin. And her starting salary was over $90,000. And so I've been, at the grind 20 plus years, and I'm thinking, seriously, this woman's making more than me. But, I mean, if you know any young person that's getting an engineering degree or anything like that, there's a lot of fields where salaries have been going up as that debt burden has been going up, which is what this is essentially saying. And then last, the monthly payment burden faced by student loan borrowers has stayed about the same or even lessened over the past 2 decades. Now, how is that? The monthly debt burden, how much they pay on a monthly basis, has actually gone down, even if their debt has gone up. The amount that they're borrowing is increasing. So what gives on that? What do you think is causing that? Okay, well, it could be the interest rate, and certainly it is when you look at, say, compared to the 1980s when we had those exorbitant interest rates that I remember so well when I was going through graduate school.
Extending the term of the loan?
They are extending the term of the loan, yes. And another thing, and I just realized I'm butchered spelling here, but another thing that is going on is they're not looking at refinancing programs that have been implemented by the federal government, or they are taking that into account without specifically mentioning it, and we're going to look at that toward the end of this presentation, see what impact that's made. So they're saying, well, look, things aren't as bad as they seem because their monthly payments are actually going down, but that's because instead of paying out over 10 years, they're paying out over 20 years, 25 years. So, I mean, you can decide for yourself whether that's a good thing, bad thing, indifferent. So cause for alarm? This is a hard question. Is student loan debt currently in crisis mode? Are we facing a crisis? And I would say that maybe in trying to address that question, there's a few things that it might help to look at. And there's 3 that I wanted to spend the rest of our time today looking at. The first is continued growth in overall student loan debt, both on an aggregate and individual level. The second is trends in regulation of the student loan market. And then the third thing we'll talk about is increasing default rate for student loans and recent efforts to address it by the Obama administration. So the impact of growing student loan debt. There was an intriguing article recently in the New York Times by a professor at University of Michigan. Her name is Susan Donarski, and she is a professor of public policy, education, and economics at University of Michigan. And she's done some interesting little pieces over the years on student loan debt. And she looks at evidence that suggests that an increase in student loans results in an increase in students attending college. Because if, after all, we have a growing number of student loans leading to a higher number or a higher amount of debt of students, but that's producing more college students, and then ultimately college graduates, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. So she's looking for studies that have correlated increasing numbers of student loans with increasing number of college attendance. And she couldn't find much on the US end, but she did find 2 intriguing studies abroad, one in South Africa and the other one in Chile. And these studies utilize something called regression discontinuity analysis. It was interesting what they did is they, in one country, the country was using a cutoff for whether they provided student loans based on a college test score, and in the other one they used a minimum credit score. But they had this, basically, they just set these scored levels. And they said if you score above this level, then you qualify for student loans. If you score below this level, you don't qualify for student loans. So they run a regression analysis and see how it spreads in terms of around that arbitrary demarcation line that they choose. And they want to see it should be fairly randomly distributed. What they found is that there's a huge jump once you get the college loan in attendance, like a 20 percentage point increase. And they conclude from that the availability of loans looks to have a positive impact on college attendance. So this raises some questions, and there's two that I want to point out. One that Dynarski addresses, and the other that, that I'm addressing. The first is this. So students may be better off with debt resulting in a degree than if they have no debt and no degree. You following me on that? However, what about students that accrue debt toward a degree but never complete? And there's been a lot of articles on this point. Those students tend to be in a bad place. It would be like taking out a home mortgage loan and paying on the home mortgage, but you never have a home. And some of us that were perpetual graduate students maybe that were working on that doctorate forever, can kind of relate to that in one sphere, but this is at a more basic level. We're talking, worst case scenario, students that we see at the community college level for years that never actually get a terminal degree. They're just giving us their money taking classes, and they're accruing debt in the process. That's the big thing, right? So if they're just doing that on their own, and that happens to be the way they like spending their pastime, fine. But if they're making this investment in their future, but they're never gaining that credentialing that allows them to actually get payoff on that, it's another thing. And then as noted by Dynarski, in some cases, students simply used the loans that were made available to them to go to a better school than they otherwise would have gone to. But they would have gone to college anyhow. So for those students that the loan didn't affect them going to college, but it affected what college they went to, the question arises as to whether or not taking out that loan to go to a better college actually provides any benefits. And if you look at the literature on that one, and this is something that, I don't know about y'all, but I tout to my students, literature is real inconclusive on that one. Now let's look at that a second. What are we saying? We're saying that if a student goes to a state school where the tuition costs are fairly low and they can manage to work and go to school without accruing debt, versus if they get into a real prestigious school and they take out a large amount of loans to complete at that school, does it pay off? There are certainly certain instances in which the answer would be yes. But in the majority of cases, there's been no conclusive evidence to show correlation there. In fact, what I tell my students quite often is it matters far more what you do, where you attend, than where you attend. It matters that you take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you wherever you're going to school. I don't know, any thoughts on that or disagreements on that? John, I see a puzzling look.
And you said it earlier, it's a case-by-case basis. Example, geology degree.
Absolutely.
Bachelor's degree at Sam Houston State, bachelor's degree at UT Austin.
Absolutely.
Be in debt, go to UT Austin, because you're going to go so much better in your career than if you went to Sam Houston Geology. I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's an easy decision to make, but that's probably an exception to the general thing that you're looking at.
And I might even add it, maybe it's a little more complicated than that even with that example, because if you get someone that ends up transferring to UT because they were able to get into UT, but it's not really a good fit for them, they kind of flounder, it's hard for them to get plugged in, they go to classes, but they don't really do anything outside, they never really connect with their professors, they make the grades to graduate from UT with a degree in geology, as opposed to someone that goes to SAM, they link up with some professors, they get involved in some research they're doing, they may be minor professors in the field, but they get engaged in it, they build some experience, they get some great internships, and as a result they really flourish in their profession. You can see how, It's complex.
It's a case by case.
Absolutely.
basis. Yeah,
Absolutely.
There's so many factors that go into it, yeah.
Do you collect data on what their students study? I mean, based on the nature of the field of study, do they have that kind of data?
I'm sure there's all kinds of data in specific areas, and there are certain areas, certain disciplines where maybe there are only certain schools that offer degrees or specialized fields, certainly. Or there's so much, heads and shoulders above the rest that, and maybe they have pretty small classes, so anyone that gets in is, looking at probably being a lot better off than if they'd gone somewhere else, no doubt. So the second factor I wanted to look at is poor regulation of the student loan marketplace. There's been a lot of comparisons made between the mortgage industry and the student loan industry. And if you remember the mortgage space prior to 2008 and the big crash and the wonderful recession that we had, some bad things were going down in the mortgage space. Basically, a lot of bad habits were being developed as they were trying to make loans for home loans more available to first-time borrowers. They were not doing due diligence in terms of credit checks. They were giving loans basically for people that far exceeded what their credit worthiness would have warranted. And then what they were doing is they were taking those loans, which we would call high-risk loans, and they were slicing and dicing them. They were signing off authority on who owns those loans and putting them in these big packages. And they were selling these packages on the open market to whoever would take it at exorbitant interest rates. Now, underlying all of this was the full faith backing of the U.S. federal government, right? So, I don't know if this is ringing a bell with you guys or not, but it wasn't a pretty scenario. And we see a similar thing going on in the student loan space right now. So what we see is that we've got these servicing agents, these companies, that are responsible for these student loans, and they're slicing and dicing these loans, and they're packaging them in these bundles, and they are being traded on exchanges. And again, if it's backed by Sallie Mae or the Department of Education, it seems like a sure bet. How could it go bad? Because even if it goes bad, the U.S. taxpayer will pick up the bill. Now what this does is, in political science lingo, this leads to a classic, what we call principal-agent problem. And a principal-agent situation is one in which the interest of the principal, the person that's wanting something done, and the agent, the person or actor that's responsible for carrying out what needs to be done, they're divergent. So in this case, the principal is the federal government, and what it wants done is student loans made out to qualified borrowers who will pay back those loans, but in turn, use them to get a higher education degree. That's the government side. The agent side is the servicing companies that are not interested in keeping the student from defaulting on the loan, because if the student defaults on the loan, the government backs up the default. And if the student comes to them and says, you know what, I'm really on the ropes and I need to refinance or I need to reschedule, there's been numerous instances that have been reported by the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau where these servicing agents have been totally unresponsive to borrowers, as in, they don't answer calls or they don't answer emails, they just ignore them. Because there's a disconnect in the incentive structure for both of these. And this has led to a lot of talk at the national level, policy-wise, for whether or not we should be eliminating institutions like Sallie Mae, and the federal government should be taking over this loan servicing, loan initiation, loan servicing business. Now, for people that advocate for less government, that puts the fear of God into them, because then the federal government becomes this big lender of student loans. But really, we have the worst of both worlds right now. The federal government is the backer of these student loans, but it's allowing other institutions to lend that money and then follow up on collecting that money. And then the third and final point that I wanted to talk about is the growing student default rates. As noted earlier in that Brookings report that came out this summer, both individual and total student debt continues to increase. Now, accompanying that has been an increase in defaults. And that's in the private space as well as the public space, and it is significant. And this is where, sitting on this nonprofit, I've seen it in spades. So we give these nonprofit loans to students. The default rate has gone through the roof. And it's threatening the viability of the trust fund that was set up for these students. And the federal government is encountering the same thing with an increasing default rate among students. And in the private sphere, they're encountering the same thing as well. The default rate is highly skewed toward for-profit trade schools and students of lower income. Those tend to be the categories where you're seeing the higher default rate. And then there was a study a few years ago in the Chronicle of Higher Ed that was talking about how the government vastly undercounts the true number of defaults, student defaults. And this is a hard number to get your hands around. Like I said, in the private sphere, they don't release this kind of data. So we know in the public sphere what the default rate is, but in the private sphere, everyone counts things differently. Like, what constitutes a default? Is it a 30-day non-payment? Is it a 60-day? Is it a 120-day, 180-day? It varies. So you're comparing apples to oranges when you're trying to look at default rates.
Question, what do you see from your perspective on that board? What do you see as the main driver for the default? Do they drop out of school, or they can't get a decent job once they graduate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all the above.
All right.
Certainly we know that there's been some transformations in the economy. We're starting to see more of a bimodal distribution in terms of students that are able to get jobs and students that are not able to get jobs. As well as we're seeing a number of students that are becoming perpetual students and not completing degrees as well. So. Repayment rates, public versus for-profit colleges. I mentioned this before we started our discussion. 54% repayment rate at public colleges and universities. 56% repayment rate at private nonprofit institutions. And you can think of those elite private universities, or not so elite private universities, but places like Baylor, TCU, etc. 36% repayment rate for all for-profit colleges. University of Phoenix, 44%, DeVry, 38%, Kaplan, 27%. For some for-profits, the repayment rates have dropped below 10%. I cite here a GAO report from 2010 that was kind of the beginning when the government started doing some undercover investigation of these for-profits and finding some real shady practices going on, but we know that that's continued. If you keep up with the news, there continues to be periodically things in the news talking about for-profits and how they really need to clamp down on them and tighten up lending for students attending these for-profits. But it seems like not that much is being done.
Well, they change the tactics. They just go around the government regulations and all this.
Sure, and you know, it's not always cut and dry because we know there are for-profits that truly provide a useful service. Have y'all heard about Full Sail College? Has that entered any of y'all's vocabulary?
Say it one more time.
Full Sail. It's called Full Sail.
Is
It's
that-
a university
is
and
that
college.
S-A-I-L or is
I
that
think it's-
S-A-L-E?
No,
The
yeah,
latter
it should
sounds
be.
really
It should be S-A-L-E, but it's S-A-I-L.
It's in Florida.
So it may just be the students I hang around with. I do a homeless ministry through our church, and inevitably, when we get young people that come through this program, they talk to me about, well, they have this degree in movie production, film production, that you can only get at Full Sail, and it only takes like 18 months and it costs some exorbitant amount, and it's out of Florida, I think, is where it's based. But how they're getting, I mean, so they're getting people in the Woodlands, you know, or in Conroe, or it's just how they're getting their tentacles out to all of these places is just beyond me. But it's becoming a real big buzzword, a real popular place, and not in a negative sense. Among these lower income students, it's a very prestigious. Yeah, I'm looking at Full Sail, even though the cost is just ridiculous.
They have a pretty
For these degrees that probably have no, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
they have a pretty robust advertising campaign and budget. It's usually through pop-ups you get on gaming websites, sports websites, so it's appealing to.
I mean, it makes sense. They have to be going where the youth are, right?
It seems like these schools are just created to take advantage of the federal loans, almost.
Yes.
It's just a scam.
Yes.
And a lot of the trade schools you were talking about are like that too. Most of the students never finished. Some of these schools go out of business after a certain amount of time. They get the kids to run up all these student loans. Those kids show up for, or students show up for school one day, the school's gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So dealing with this increase in student loan defaults, this summer, President Obama signed an executive order expanding what's called the pay system. This is a system that's been around for a while, and the long and short of it is that I've got some details on it, but it basically extends the payback period to 25 years. It caps the amount of students' monthly payments to 10% of their discretionary income. So discretionary income is counted as whatever the government calculates as the federal poverty rate, and then if you take that federal poverty rate and go 10% above that, everything above that would be what they would call discretionary income for calculation purposes for this. So in other words, it's far less how they calculate their income than what their income actually is. There's some other programs that have been around, income-based repayment, the IDR, been in place for years. They have less generous repayment options, but they're still highly preferable to just slugging along at whatever the original terms of your loan were. And you know what's amazing is the better educated the student, the more likely they are to know about these things. The less well educated the student, or the lower the socioeconomic background that they come from, the less resources they have available to them to be made aware of these programs. So just to give you an idea of the impact that this could make, for a student with $40,000 in income and a $60,000 student loan debt, under the original IVR program, monthly payments would be $281 a month. Under the revised IVR or the new pay system, monthly payments would be $188 a month. Under the original terms of the loan, the payment would have been $738 a month. Yeah.
And where again is the money made up? Is it longer term to the loan? Is that what we're talking about here?
It's a lot longer term.
A lot longer term.
But also you have to realize that after so many years, they can, it has a year limit. So it may be a 20-year limit, it may be a 25-year limit. But if they reach that limit and they have not paid off the loan, then it's forgiven the rest of it.
It's actually
forgiven.
under the
Forgiven.
IVR.
So in other words, I've paid their loan.
Yeah, your slate is wiped
Why
clean.
am I not surprised?
No, it's actually easier to look at Gary Brown's paying off my student loans. If you look at the IVR, if you teach at community college or high school, they lower that cap at 10 years. So the IVR is traditionally 20 years. If you go into the fire, police, EMT, high school or secondary education, it's a 10-year maximum. And what you can do, what students have done is borrow that 1% that borrows $100,000. You teach in high school for 10 years, you're never going to pay that full amount back.
Sure.
So it ends up being put on the taxpayers.
Yeah.
But there's reasons these are in place because, like you said, those loans are over. So if you come out with $80,000 and you're teaching, you're a nurse, you're never going to be able to make those monthly payments.
Certainly. And so, you can say, well, why aren't you getting the 738 as opposed to the 281 or the 188? Because what you get on that is zero. They just walk away from it. because it looks so daunting, they don't even know how to deal with it. And so it's something as opposed to nothing in this case. And it's interesting, I don't know if you keep up with what's going on in Europe, but in Great Britain, for example, they used to have, it was basically a free ride for higher ed. It was publicly subsidized. Well, they moved to a loan system, but it's on this kind of sliding scale thing. So you get a loan to get a higher ed degree, and I was talking with some guys at a conference a couple of years ago about this, and they were kind of laughing about it. They were from the UK, and they were saying that, now you have to pay for your college, but you take out loans, and these loans are on the sliding scale, and so when you get out in the workforce, you have to be making over a certain income to even make payments. And then it's a sliding scale depending on how much you make, how much you pay, and then there's a cap on the total, or on the maximum amount you can pay monthly, and there's a cap on the number of years you can pay. So in effect, what they're doing is they're still subsidizing higher ed in Britain. They just put a more capitalist face on it, if you will. Whereas we're going at it from the opposite direction of it being a private market, and now it looks subsidized, like we're moving in a more socialist direction, if you will.
Yeah, but the Europeans, I mean, that may sound socialist for the Europeans, but they already program their kids at a very young age. They're already separating them. In Germany, at 9 years old, they're separated in trade school and high school.
Absolutely.
People at trade school never get the chance to go on to university. And the same happens in France as well.
Sure.
So the opportunities that we offer here in America aren't even available.
And you know what? Those trends are starting to filter in here. I was listening to something in the news recently where they were talking about increasingly junior high counselors, or ISDs, are starting to track students from a very early age. And the idea is, they have such dismal graduation rates that they're saying, well, all the students shouldn't have to have, 4 years of English and 4 years of math and all that stuff. If they're wanting to be an artist or whatever, then they should only have to take 1 year of math at the high school level, right? So they're tracking them early. Now that sounds great to the student, although,
at that age.
Yeah, I was going to say, trying to figure out what a freshman, what do you want to be when you grow up? NFL football star. I don't know. But so they have to track them like that, but it's going to have huge implications on the graduation rate, right? Because they're going to be totally unqualified, even if they change their mind. At least now, if you kind of force feed them a basic curriculum through high school, the idea is that as they mature a little bit, they may start developing a real liking of engineering or something, right? Even though they didn't have the highest math scores, so they really bust their chops when they're at community college or whatever, and they improve their math skill to the level to where they're eligible to go into an engineering program at a university and finish up. That opportunity is going to be increasingly rare.
I think another trend you see in HISD, probably other places, is the specialized high school. The high school, there's a new high school that's opening up on gas and oil. Preparing people for gas and oil jobs, and there's all these technologically oriented places. They never call it tracking, even though that's what it is, because
Right.
that wouldn't be politically acceptable. It's opportunity to get a job.
High-paying job.
Yeah, right after graduation
Right,
from high
absolutely.
school, if you want.
And that's a societal challenge we face in spades. I mean, we can't deny it, right? With the loss of our manufacturing base and everything, they got to have something better than flipping burgers. As Molly Ivins used to say, even with a 2-burger flipping family, you can't put food on the table.
Well, it's interesting that there's a reaction. I live in Houston, so I watch the news on this all the time. And, there's a big issue going on right now with respect to Yates High School. Right? Historically, African American school, very low performing, which HISD proposes closing finally and replacing it with one of these new technologically oriented institutes. And the community is just up in arms about it because they see it as a kind of tracking,
Right.
as a kind of less than.
Your kid can't be a doctor or a nurse or anything like that. Absolutely.
But that's been offered for years and years, and it's been a very low performing school.
Yeah, there's not easy answers on a lot of this. So what about our students at the community college level? Community college students represent a quarter of all full-time undergraduates. Now this was, I don't know why I couldn't find more recent data, but this is from '08, so you know this number has increased. I mean, the trend has just skyrocketed. They generally have lower incomes than students attending four-year colleges, and although facing lower college costs because they're attending community college, they're just as likely to need financial aid. It was 83% at the time was calculated qualifying for financial aid. Community college students in need are more likely to turn to private loans without exploring governmental loan options than students at four-year colleges. Part of that may be the advising side, but I think part of that is the family. You know, if you're coming from a family that has no history of applying for college, you know, one thing I've learned in this role as honors director, as I get out into high schools and I get this big education, is you would be amazed at the number of high school students that do not complete a Common App or Texas Common App or any complete a FAFSA or TASFA, any of those things that if you're, you know, middle class, Americana, you just kind of are ingrained, you know, at your middle class high school, they're tracking students through to do all these things for college prep in order to apply for different colleges and see what kind of federal monies they qualify for. 38% of community college students graduating with associate's degree graduated with student loan debt. That may seem like a low number, but it's actually pretty high when you consider how low costs we have. And it's amazing that the number of students that take out loans continue to work, and they're doing that to maybe just knock out their core before they even transfer. In the for-profit sector, 2-year degrees, over 90% graduated with student loan debt. It's a big difference. So, some conclusions. There's an awful lot that can be drawn, hopefully, from this, but these are some things just come to mind. Student loan debt increasing in the U.S., along with student loan default rates. That's a no-brainer. Student loan debt is disproportionately impacts certain types of students, and this has social and economic ramifications. And that should speak volumes to us as community college faculty and staff. The federal government has taken steps to reduce default rates, and we looked at some of them through the pay system, IVR. However, there's still a lot of work here, and there's a lot of controversy about the current repayment schemes. A lot of people are claiming that this is just going to lead to higher default rates on student loans as students see that they can get these sweet deals going through school. So they argue that what's currently being done is going to move us in a direction of public subsidization of higher education. With the costs associated with college education continuing to increase in combination with rising student debt, it's becoming more important for us to educate our students on smart ways to borrow money. If you have a choice between a 10% or 15% or 20% student loan and a 3.8% federal loan or a 4.0% nonprofit loan, come on, that should be a no-brainer. Yet we have a lot of students that aren't even going for the low-hanging fruit. They don't know about the low-hanging fruit. And it's not just the interest rates, but it's the repayment schedules. It's interest accruing while they're in school. If you take out a private loan, interest starts accruing the moment you take out that loan. If you take out a federally subsidized loan, interest does not start accruing until after you get your degree, 6 months after in most cases. And then for students who already have debt, income-driven repayment options have become increasingly important. We need to educate students further on. So, I'm sorry, I feel like this is more of a downer than an upper. It's not like we've discovered new ways to identify God or anything, but I think it's a very important problem that we face, that our students face, and that we're going to face as parents as well.
Well then, David, are you more on the coming apocalypse side of this than an alarmist side?
I think what we are facing is we are facing a growing likelihood that the American public is going to have to eat the cost of these student loans. And we're already seeing that happen inch by inch. So what's happening by default is the increasing subsidization of higher education. Even though we won't call a spade because we say, by God, we're still a capitalist economy in which the responsibility for higher education rests with the individual, not collectively with society. But increasingly what we're seeing is we're playing this game like we did with the home mortgage situation, where people that have no means of paying these things back are taking out these loans in order to get through school.
David, I think that should be rephrased. It's not the federal subsidization of education, it's the federal subsidization of banking business.
Well, absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right. So as long as that middleman's there, then basically it is a welfare transfer payment from the taxpayer to the banking industry or to the loan servicing industry. Much bigger than just the banking industry.
Yeah. I mean, who are we subsidizing here? What's our priority?
I think
People
you're
that are
absolutely
already
right.
wealthy, or people that need to be educated?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and if we had a healthy public discussion on this, just like, say, for example, probably with healthcare, it would have to involve looking at the current opportunity costs that are associated with our system as it exists. We can say that it's a private system, but it's not. It's the worst of two worlds in some ways. It seems like, right? It's government subsidies, but they're not subsidies going directly to the students. They're subsidies that are going to, again, the people that make these loans and the people that service these loans. And they're going disproportionately to for-profits who may not be tracking students long-term to position them to get well-paying jobs, which is what we ultimately need.
You mentioned the medical business, it's very similar there. Our medical costs are way out of line.
Sure.
You could argue. Obamacare, and basically what we're doing is we're subsidizing people that can't afford premiums, but the insurance companies are getting the money.
Right.
So you're subsidizing insurance companies, you're subsidizing the banks. It's really messed up. It's a dangerous path to be on. And the way I look at this problem, all this stuff that's going on are little bandages on what's a much broader issue here. You got to look at the fundamentals of this. The reason there's so much debt, number one, is there are too many people going to college, and colleges cost too much. Those are the main factors. Okay, you bring both of those down, and the problem goes away. But the problem is, in our society, we don't operate that way. Okay, it's opportunity for all, everything for everybody. If you want to go to school, we'll give you money to go to school. If you want to do this, if you want to go get sick, we'll give you money to pay for your ailments. It's everything for everybody. And I think what's going to happen in our society, and I'm on the apocalyptic side of this, is that it will be too late before we realize we've gone down a rat hole and we can't crawl our way back out of it. That's my fear of the future. And I see it in all the major aspects of our society right now. And I'm very fearful of it.
I was thinking the same thing. It's just a symptom of a larger disease. It's in college debt, it's in healthcare, it's in consumer products, it's everywhere. It's just it's separating the middle class from their money. It's bringing the middle class down or basically doing away with the middle class to a certain degree. Because if the entire middle class is in debt and they're continually, if wages are going down in a lot of different areas, then you have the upper class or those, whatever you want to call them, the mortgage brokers, everybody up here getting more of the money in the middle class, having a smaller percentage. Pretty soon you have only two classes.
But what you're talking about isn't necessarily being caused by government policy. It's a structural flaw.
Yeah, and that's what
So you are saying, in effect, you're both saying apocalypses, but you're pointing to different causes, and I think that you both have good points.
I think it's a cultural problem to a certain extent.
I mean, if you look at healthcare, for example, our cost compared to other industrialized nations was out of whack before Obamacare. So we can't say that Obamacare has caused it. We could say that it's not the right answer, but the reality is it was a broken system before we moved toward, the Affordable Care Act. But in the same way with higher education is a broken system. And you're right, we say that every student needs to go through higher ed if they want to succeed in today's society. That may be a false bill of goods, but the other side of that coin is, then what do you got as an alternative?
Exactly.
And so if they don't need a 4-year degree, what do they need in order to be able to put food on the table, put their kids through college, and live the American dream?
And that's why it's a structural issue with our society, because it seems like no matter which road you go down, it's not a good road, okay? It's Halloween 13, or how many movies they made. But it's not good at the other end of the trail. But the irony of it is, as well, saying all these things, complaining about high medical costs, yet where does the world come if they're sick? They come here. We're the people that cure Ebola, I hope. We're the people that do all this stuff. People are flown in from all over the country. I need an operation. A dictator in some podunk country in South America, they fly to here to the best hospitals in the world and they get cured. That's because we've got the best medical care, but it's expensive. Same thing with education. We educate the world. Send your people back over here, they go back to the Middle East and they become whatever they do over there, but they've been educated in the United States. So on the one hand, I don't kind of like some of the things that we're talking about, but on the other hand, you kind of got to argue, hey, yeah, you kind of get what you pay for. We're the best, but it costs to be the best. And where's the right balance?
Right.
Between still being the best, yet being affordable. And I don't know if you can solve that problem.
You want to be
That's
the
where- that's
best
where I
for the
struggle.
rest.
That's where I struggle. How do you be the best and
I
still
think
be?
it's interesting
I
that
agree.
Germany now is saying, we'll educate Americans for free. They've offered this to the world, and they're opening that up. And so I think they're seeing an opportunity to compete and get some of the better students to go to Germany for a free education, but then you get to stay and go into their businesses and companies. And I'm familiar enough with the education system in Germany to know that they're not gonna take everybody in the US. They're gonna take the ones that can qualify for that. And they have several tiers within their education system. So there's a top level, and then there's like a middle level that does sort of, the top level would be like history and philosophy, and then they've got this middle level is accounting and sort of business level, and then they've got the lower technical colleges that do workforce sorts of things. And I know they're not gonna just take anybody, so they're gonna take our best students who can go over and get a free education, and then maybe they'll come back, or maybe they'll stay in Germany for jobs that are available in Europe. And with the EU, that's more transferable, they can kind of go anywhere in Europe. But basically, they've looked at our system and said, there's a chance for us to compete for some of the best students.
Yeah. I like global competition. I think it's healthy, so.
And what I think it's attractive, you've got a child that can compete on that level, or is looking at the top colleges here and then a top college in Germany, but it's gonna be free. That's gonna be attractive to get your undergraduate and then maybe go to Oxford for your graduate, or whatever other opportunities you might have.
Maybe that'll drive our costs down.
Yeah.
To a certain degree, Germany has a very effective system. A problem he was talking about, we think here that everyone needs to go to college, and that's not true. Not only from, are you qualified to go to college perspective, you need other areas to be successful. You need those trade areas. In these trade schools we're talking about, they don't fill the bill. They're there to collect money. They don't train people for certain areas where we need to increase our manufacturing. We become a service-based industry. Most of our manufacturing now comes from foreign companies like Toyota and Honda moving their companies over here because it's cheaper than shipping the cars over here. So, yeah, they're located all through South Carolina and North Carolina. So, but what manufacturing do we create on our own? It is a solely service-based economy viable in the long term. China's, go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't thinking about it.
Of course.
I was gonna say, something that you didn't mention is the veterans loans also, because the government was trying to limit the amount of money these for-profit universities lend students or let them borrow, but they said, well, no, veterans don't count as those students, so they separated those. So that is another big part that we are now calculating with your numbers.
Yes, And those for-profits will be exploiting that veteran
Exactly,
population and the money that they
exactly.
get from them, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right, I haven't really even, I don't even know that much about the veteran space, but I know it makes sense, it's gonna be increasingly huge with the sheer numbers of young people that we have coming back that are gonna be pursuing higher ed on the government dole.
And let me throw out a structural thing. I know we're running out of time, but I've been hogging you around. But structurally, I would say that 10 to 25% of the students I have in my classroom shouldn't be in college yet. They shouldn't be there. They're not ready for it, okay? So here's a structural solution. Make a benevolent dictator, okay? Everybody, when they graduate from high school, has to work for 3 years, 4 years at a menial job. Okay, I mean, the best job they can find, but they have to work before they go to school. What happens? They earn enough money to go to school and they become mature. So when they're in school, they don't screw around and mess everything up and default on their loans later on. It may or may not work, but there have to be some giant differences in our culture and the way we do things in order to solve these issues. And we don't seem to be the kind of society that wants to do that, to face hard decisions, to totally change the structure of the way we do things. That's why I don't think we'll be successful in the long run, because we're afraid, we're spoiled.
When England has the gap year, and Germany also has required service years, so you either have to do community service of some sort, or you have to go to the military for a certain amount of time. But that allows for some of that maturity and experience, and maybe appreciating being in the classroom afterwards.
Maybe they've got something there.
But I think in Germany's structure, they do have the tracking, which is good because they don't say that everyone has to go to college. But the challenge for that is that 3rd and 4th grade, basically they're tracked at that age based on their parents' education. I think that's a significant problem. There's many students who will do very well even though their parents never went to college. And then vice versa. So if your parent went to college and you get tracked to go on to Abitur and get your top level high school to go on. There is an opportunity to get out of that, but you have to go to night school, and it's very, very hard to get at a higher level. There's 3 levels of graduation out of high school, and so it's very hard to get out of that. And I think that goes against the fundamental American view that you can make your own destiny, and to some extent. And
Well,
so,
alter the tracking system so that you can fulfill that. In other words, change the rules.
right.
I think these
Still do
structural
it, but change the rules.
arguments are interesting, but I think we may be losing sight of one aspect. That's long-term, and these are theories. You're facing, I think you just touched on this initially in the beginning, David, the implications, the pressing implications, as you're talking about hundreds of thousands of students that cannot buy homes, that cannot take the jobs they want, cannot go into higher education they want to pursue a master's degree or higher, that we're facing it. These students cannot discharge this debt, and they're going to be burdened with these, especially with the private loans, higher and higher interest rates. When we talk about the government subsidizing this, they are and they aren't. The students, we're going to end up paying, us as a community, or we'll end up paying a large percentage of this, but the students are still responsible for this. It cannot be dissolved, cannot be discharged through bankruptcy. They may default, but they're going to have to, their wages can be garnished. This is going to impact marriage rates, reproduction, housing, where you live, and that's happening today. That's happening right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And their wages probably will be garnished, right? From what I've heard, they do go after and garnish wages on these federal loans and stuff.
So it's not like we're subsidizing the housing industry or the mortgage loans. This is debt that you cannot, it's just onerous to discharge. In fact, it very rarely happens.
And that's why I say that in the long term, I think that there's gonna have to be some debt forgiveness. And that societally, I don't know what that would look like, right? In this political climate, I can't imagine it happening without, all-out war breaking out between parties, but.
You know what that sounds a little bit like? Sounds like immigration. The argument, you gotta
It
put up the
does.
fence, you gotta put up the fence.
Right.
First. If you're gonna cure the problem, you
Right.
gotta put up the fence.
And-
If you're gonna cure that problem, you gotta change the fundamental structure so it doesn't happen again.
Right.
And that's where we're too, use the word, we're too spoiled or wimpy to do that, so it doesn't happen and things just get worse.
We don't,
It seems like the lender should be punished as well. I mean, there's people who are taking advantage of this to make money and then saying, well, the student has to deal with the outcome, but the lender should take some responsibility in lending to people that will not ever graduate or produce enough money to repay, but we don't want to we don't wanna punish them either, because that's gonna have market implications that we don't wanna deal with.
But that goes back to our political system, who's running the country, you know?
Millionaires.
All these politicians up there are, you know, all have lobbyists, they're knee deep or neck deep in lobbyists. And I don't think we have the political system to make changes anymore. I think the only ones that make changes are the money brokers at the top, because they, you know, it's a pessimistic view, but I think we have two parties that won't agree on anything, and I think both of them are driven by lobbyists or manipulative. You look at the pharmacy companies, you look at everywhere. These loan companies, these loan institutions, you know they have lobbyists down there.
So Ron, there was a book that I read once that this guy lived on the Gold Coast, very affluent, and they lived in the servants' quarters because they couldn't afford to keep the big house. And he used to refer to the fact that he kept a John Deere hat under the seat in his pickup truck, so that when the revolution came and they were storming the gates of this giant mansion, he could put on the John Deere cap and look like one of the revolutionaries and say, you know, they went that way. And so I'm starting to think maybe I should have brought my John Deere cap, because it sounds like the revolution's starting in here. I don't know, but.
On that note, I'd say there's a really good article by Nick Hanauer, who's made his money. He's one of the 1%, and his article is The Pitchforks Are Coming.
There you go.
So look for Nick Hanauer's
When the
article.
pitchforks
It's
come,
really
make sure
good.
you got your John Deere hat so you can blend in.
It's a shame that the historian had to leave, but maybe some of you can answer the question. In American history, can you cite any moment where there was a major paradigm shift, structural change along the lines of what John is suggesting is necessary? And I'm really drawn to that myself, and because I don't see a way to salvage what we understand to be the American dream without serious structural change. The American dream is out of reach for too many people. And so, is there any moment in the past where such structural change occurred in America?
The Great Depression.
Yeah, I
qualifies for
agree.
that?
The New Deal.
Yeah.
So that would probably be one of the best
The
examples.
Great Depression, who brought, and the World Wars that brought up, quote unquote, the greatest generation that ever lived, okay? Yes, there you are, but now we've evolved from that. And
So
not in such a good way.
cataclysmic global chaos, you know,
That's
you need that
encouraging.
to
I mean,
stimulate.
it's encouraging, but it's not encouraging that it took a direction. But there is precedent in American history for something cataclysmic is probably not the right word, but truly significant.
Sometimes you gotta go
structural-
through the bad in order to get
Yeah.
the good. I
Yeah.
think that's reality.
We mentioned politicians and lobbyists. Politicians and lobbyists by themselves cannot do anything. They hurt people to support their issues and agendas. If the people get disfranchised and see how many bad things happening, therefore they will rise and the pitchfork will come
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
Then they will not believe in politicians anymore, and then those structural changes will happen.
You're better off hoping for something like the Great Depression, though, because history shows you that with a complete revolution, what comes afterwards is usually not good, you know. If we had a complete breakdown in our society, I don't think we'd go back to what we had before, you know. What would we see afterwards?
A lot more people have guns now than they did back then.
And they're buying,
Scares me.
and they're buying them by, you know,
Yeah.
by the millions, and they're buying machine guns.
I think if we could somehow meld a structural change along the lines of what John has suggested, where people have to go out and do something in the world for the polis, as it were, before going to school again, and make that service-oriented. That is, there'd have to be some type of payment, but there's so much that can be done for the benefit of the polis, as it were. I mean, not just filling your own bank account so you can go to UT in 4 years, you know, but doing something for the public good. That would be really significant, wouldn't it? I mean, and it would be a structural change, and also it would be a change in social consciousness, take us away from all this narcissism that you also referenced.
Yeah, no, I don't know, I mean, it may be pie in the sky, but something's gotta
Frankly,
give,
that's what I
something's gotta
thought,
give.
that's what I thought might have come out of the Obama administration, you know, when it first began. You know,
As you
hope and change.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, David.